This is medical video history from the J. Bay Jacobs Library for the history of obstetrics and gynecology in America. It's a fine spring afternoon in May of 2007. We're in San Diego, California at this time, and my guest today is Dr. Lawrence D. Longo. We're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you.
It's May 2007, and since San Diego is now the location of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists annual meeting, this is the perfect time to be able to get together with some of our fine friends who are here. Dr. Longo has certainly had a well-recognized and recommended career, and I think when many people think of the history of obstetrics and gynecology, they certainly think of Dr. Longo.
One of the antique artifacts.
Nah. Our program today, our focus today, is largely going to relate to what Dr. Longo has accumulated and accomplished in the way of history, and it is substantial. I think there's probably no one else in the U.S. who could match him in terms of what we've done, what he has done in terms of gathering up information and photos and artifacts. And of course this has been accompanied by numerous grants and articles and things of this nature. Obstetricians and gynecologists, of course, rely on journals and pictures and diagrams. My own count, and certainly subject to your modification, is that you've been responsible for 211 books and important publications, and 2 more are being wrapped up right at this time. 67 of these publications have related in one way or another to history in obstetrics and gynecology, and an equivalent number of 67 really have, I think in my view, related to the interrelationships between this specialty and to health, and particularly the health of women. I count now at least 70-some more publications still coming down the line. Is that fair to say?
Hopefully.
Okay.
Lord willing.
It's an honest intended number, at least at this time. Let me start by asking you how you see the overall status of the publications that you've had. That is, what parts of our specialty have they covered, and do they differ much from the 72 that you're now working on, or have you reached out in some new directions?
Well, since you mentioned the history of our specialty, a current project is putting together a portfolio of the tentative title is The Gravid Uterus and Its Contents, and it is consists of illustrations from classic works starting in 1492 with Johannes Ketham, who published the first anatomical figure in a printed book. And this happened to be there were 4, and one of them happened to be of a pregnant woman. Now, of course, this is quite cartoonish by today's standard. And then we go through the 1500s, 1600s, up until the end of the 19th century, and take these. There are 100, presently we have 120, and then for each of these, I've written an essay on its importance, why it had any relevance to the particular time, and then something about the artists and engravers and all. But the idea is to try to help give a picture of the evolution of our ideas of the growth of the fetus, embryo. A lot of it includes embryology, placentology, teratology. So we're hoping to finish that within a few months and have
Now,
it published.
is this going to be a publication or?
Hopefully,
Okay.
yes. Yeah,
I mean,
speaking with several presses about it.
now you said you were both looking at, I guess what I'd call the physiology or the normal anatomy of the past, and also looking at how some of these things moved on into abnormalities or disease processes. Is that a fair
Right, yes.
statement?
Because going back to the early, 1500s and 1600s, there was a great mythology about why a baby would be abnormal, and ideas from all the way from the fact that the mother had sinned or the father had sinned to just some capricious act of the gods. And so there's been surprising a great literature on abnormal development throughout the ages.
As you and I, and to some extent me, have looked back at these things over the years, and I just ask if you'd like to comment on it. What I've seen has been that even 200-300 years ago, the people who identified the abnormalities and wrote about them were very good about the abnormalities themselves. They had a good description, let's say, of a hydatid mole or something like this.
Right.
What they didn't have, of course, was the vaguest idea of what it all meant,
Right.
or indeed what one would do about it.
Exactly.
How are you reaching across all these boundaries in your work, new works?
Well, that's difficult. We're trying to trace the ideas that anatomists, early obstetricians had, and we're including work by midwives. There have been several important books printed in the 16 and 1700s by midwives in France and Germany and England particularly, and trying to trace the idea of how people thought of fetal development and their concepts of the relation of the fetus to the mother as far as its circulation, for instance. It was only really established, for instance, in the late 1700s by William Hunter and his brother John, that in fact the fetal circulation was separate from that of the mother. And it's this type of thing, of trying to get some understanding of the formation of amniotic fluid and the growth of the placenta in relation to the growth of the fetus and that kind of thing. But part of the point is we're trying to use these illustrations from very rare books, which most people have never seen or have never been reproduced. And it's, to me, so incredible, the beauty of these illustrations, these images, and the work that went into producing them and engraving them and printing them in these volumes.
Just for my own interest, and I'm sure for viewers who will look at that in years to come, was there a time when what you're describing accurately is there was a description of the diseases and the abnormalities? Was there a time when you saw a move to, could anything be done about these conditions, or did it depend an awful lot on what the circumstances were?
Yeah. I think the main impetus on thinking about what could be done really was mid-19th century and later. So before that, I don't really think of a good example of where anybody thought they could do anything about it. Now, as far as obstetrics per se is concerned, yes, we have in the early 1700s the first description of the obstetrical forceps and how a woman with obstructed labor could be delivered without having to labor for days or longer and end up with a dead baby or maybe a dead mother, or if she did live, having ending up with sloughing of the vaginal wall and vagina and a vesicovaginal fistula or that type of thing. Maybe we can come back to that when we speak of some international aspects. But it's probably with the invention of of course the forceps are believed to have been invented by the Chamberlain family back in the 1600s, but it was the secret instrument, quotes unquotes, for almost a century. And then it was only early in the 1800s with writers such as Edmund Chapman and others that first William Gifford, that showed illustrations of the forceps, and this became general knowledge.
Yeah, just to hark back to something you just said, of course, one thing we've seen in the ACOG's library is a lot of emphasis on diagnosis and not much emphasis on treatment. Right. And you alluded to that. Do you want to carry that a bit further for us?
Well, it's just a lot. So much of it has to do, as with most of, I think, what we do in medicine and life, is it's a product of the time. And now, of course, in the early 21st century, we have all these wonderful modalities available to us in terms of diagnostic abilities, molecular medicine for making diagnoses, and maybe such things on the horizon as gene therapy. But we have to remember that it was only in the, say, late 19th century that, for instance, doing something as simple as we would think straightforward as a cesarean section became a reality, because up until 1850, the maternal mortality rate following cesarean section was close to 100%. In fact, as you know, it was outlawed in Paris and several other localities because it was just the kiss of death. And so they would only be performed either when the mother was dying or shortly thereafter to try to save the baby if possible. And it was only through the work of a number of individuals that by the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that the maternal mortality rate from cesarean section was less than 10%. And that's in a sense a very modern development in just the last century.
In doing a quick count of your publications, because I was interested in all of the things that you've accomplished across such a wide range, about 300, close to 300 of your publications relate to history, I mean, in some way.
Oh.
And beyond that, there's an amount that's in process reaching out toward 100, which are, can we do something about all of this?
Well, most of my life has been involved in what some people would regard as the basic science of reproduction, issues of fetal oxygenation, which I suppose would be the theme of my life if I had to express it that way, and hypoxia. This involved work with initially carbon monoxide and trying to develop a method to quantify respiratory gas exchange across the placenta, and then that led to some peripheral things such as being involved in helping to prepare the Surgeon General's reports on the smoking and health, and then being involved in legislation, for instance, placing warning labels on cigarette packages for pregnant women, and then involved in passage of the Clean Air Act. But most of it's been involved with hypoxia. For the last 2 decades, my work is mainly related to fetal cerebral blood flow, the regulation of vascular tone in the fetus, and the regulation of various signal transduction mechanisms and gene expression events that relate to the whole development of the vascular system and the relation to the metabolism of the developing brain.
I took at least a look on some of the things that are in process that you're doing that I was able to find, and counted up something well over 60, actually probably closer to 70 studies of things in process that you're looking at, building on the base that you had, which I think is
different aspects.
Yeah. So. But that's it's a broad base, but you're building on it very effectively, I think.
But it was all an accident, really. When I was a resident at USC, LA County Hospital, I was happy doing clinical studies, but something happened, and I became very interested in brain damage in children and cerebral palsy, mental retardation, and I thought in a rather simple-minded way that, well, if I could spend a few years in research, I could get this sorted out, because as you recall, that was during the late 1950s and early 60s. The idea was that if a child had brain damage, well, it was the obstetrician's fault,
of course.
And so it was really because of that impetus that one thing led to another.
Do you, we're talking about publications from the past, are there things on the horizon that you're working on that would be interesting for us to hear about?
Well, I think perhaps some of the most exciting work is the regulation of gene expression in fetus, the placenta and fetus, in response to maternal stress, such as maternal protein deprivation, food deprivation, or hypoxia. And we're trying to understand how these stresses can alter the methylation patterns of the certain genes, and then this be reflected in changes in the proteins that are going to be part of this whole spectrum of what we now call the fetal origins of adult disease. As you know, there's a considerable body of epidemiologic and clinical evidence that fetuses that are small for gestational age, stressed in utero, that they grow up to, as adults, to have problems relating to cardiovascular disease, coronary artery disease, cerebral vascular accidents, diabetes, and a whole laundry list of other problems. This whole field of what's referred to as epigenesis or epigenetics, and I'm trying to get at the mechanism of that, is consuming a great deal of our attention.
Do you find that there are a number of investigators out there now who approach you based on what you've done, and to see if they can, I guess, grow on some of your ideas as they set up protocols and things of that nature?
To a certain extent. I think the thing that I find amusing is to go to a meeting and have people say, "Oh, are we related to Longo?"
He's been publishing forever, yeah.
He's long gone off the scene. But yes, we have collaborations going with people at probably a dozen different universities around the country. And because, as you know, the saying, art, it's I, but in science, it's we, and it's by these collaborations. And I feel that to a great extent, it's because of wonderful collaborators, terrific postdoctoral fellows, many who have come from overseas, that we've been able to do the different things we've done.
What's your geographic base these days?
For many years, I've been in Southern California at Loma Linda University, and I head what's called the Center for Perinatal Biology there. We have 10 National Institute of Health funded investigators in our group, and all of whom are doing basic or translational science. Yeah.
Are there, you think, adequate funds going into these areas?
Oh, not at all.
Not at all.
No, as you know, some years ago, you were instrumental in helping to form the Reproductive Scientists Development Program, which is jointly funded by the NIH and private industry. That was back in the late 80s, and it was in an accident in a way it was an accident, because we realized that in academic departments there's a dearth of research. In fact, when I first went to for a fellowship interview with the physiologist under whom I worked at the University of Pennsylvania, he thought I was an internist, and he was quizzing me about what field of internal medicine I was in. And I said, "No, Doctor," this was Robert E. Forrester. I said, "No, Dr. Forrester, I'm an obstetrician gynecologist." And his jaw dropped, and he looked at me, he said, "My God, can you read and write?" And,
well, I think you've changed that image.
That was the idea. And if you looked, I was asked to do a report for the Institute of Medicine that was published in a book they did in the early 90s on research priorities in academic departments of obstetrics and gynecology. And it was just very depressing to see how, in relation to many other major departments in academic medicine, internal medicine, pediatrics, etc., how our specialty was just at the bottom of the barrel as far as research funding. And it's still, despite the small success we've had in the reproductive scientists program with some terrific young people who I hope and I believe are helping to change the specialty, that the funds are so inadequate, the opportunities are so great, the time in which we live, there's such wonderful challenges and opportunities from the standpoint of understanding the molecular basis, cellular basis of problems. But the resources for funding this type of thing and supporting it are just not there. That's not where the present priorities of our government lie.
Are there, picking on that one particular point, which is an important one, are there certain agencies or institutions or other that you would be interested in dealing with the basic science and not some quick clinical report?
Well, as you know, Warren, it's mainly the National Institutes of Health that funds most basic research and translational research in this country. Pharmaceutical companies, of course, do a lot, but that's more in trying to develop new drugs and variations on a theme. So I think we have to look to the NIH. There are other groups such as the March of Dimes, Birth Defects Foundation, American Heart Association gives some funds for this type of work. But it's really the NIH to which we have to look.
I would seem to me in these days in which there's criticism of some of the places our research is reaching, that attempts to develop the base data that you're talking about would be something that we should focus on.
That would be.
Do you have any particular studies going on at this moment you'd like to say a word about?
Well, I think the gene regulation, the role of methylation is important. But I do have a burden for our specialty that I think from a clinical standpoint, we have such major problems in the rising prevalence of premature deliveries and the cost to individuals and societies since, for instance, when I was a resident at Los Angeles County Hospital back in the
we don't have to tell
long time ago, why if a baby was born at 28 weeks gestation, it only had about a 5% chance of living, as you recall those days. Well, now it's the inverse of that. They have a 95% chance. But many of those babies, and now that they're being saved at earlier and earlier times in gestation, a high incidence of those infants go on to have brain damage as children and adults. So I think that's one of the great challenges. Another challenge that I think we have in clinical medicine, as you know, I spent 3 years in West Africa working, trying to save the world and didn't. That is the healthcare in the developing countries, the problems of women as far as maternal mortality, infant mortality. These are major issues. And vesicovaginal fistulae, for instance, when I was in West Africa, I repaired over 100 vesicovaginal fistulae because these women, their lives are just totally destroyed when they have this. They're outcasts in their own homes and societies. And I just feel so strongly that as a specialty, we should be trying to do more to help improve the lives of these kinds of people. That may sound strange from a guy that's really works as a basic scientist, but I think that's one of the great challenges of our specialty.
There's basic science at the molecular level, but there's basic science in taking care of human beings too. I think
absolutely.
If, as perhaps our last question, if there is one sort of research that ought to have more funding attention today, what is it? That's a big question, I guess. A topic, perhaps.
Afraid I haven't thought about that. I think we have so many problems, both in maternal care and infant well-being. So many challenges: prematurity, preeclampsia, diabetes, and that all of these things are important and helping to help these infants that are born too soon to grow up to be normal, productive adults is a great challenge.
Let me thank you for being with us today, and
well, thank you.
Because I think it, really in the year 2007 is important that we look ahead at the big problems, not just the little ones.
And if I could just say a concluding comment, I think for young obstetricians and gynecologists in this specialty, there's so many wonderful opportunities and so many challenges. And I'm always reminded of the comment of Albert Schweitzer, the great physician who served in Gabon, that for true happiness in life is achieved by a life of service. And I think as people in our specialties, that's one of the great opportunities we have to serve.
I'd like to say I think you've already accomplished it.
Well,
Thank you for being
Boy.
with us.
thank you, Warren. A great friend.